When King Charles's former butler broke his decades-long silence, no one expected the words that followed, not even the palace. In one chilling interview, he revealed events so disturbing, so politically explosive, they've been buried for over 2 decades. What really happened behind closed doors the night before Diana's funeral, and why has the firm worked so hard to silence it? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began quietly, almost as a whisper. A retired staffer, long faded from public view, agreeing to sit down for what was expected to be a nostalgic reflection. But within minutes, the tone shifted. The air thickened. What came next was not sentiment but shock. In an unfiltered, emotion-laced account, King Charles's former butler laid bare a narrative the royal family has spent years locking behind ceremonial walls. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried the weight of truth. And as his words spilled out, so did decades of silence. It wasn't just one event he described. It was an entire night of concealed chaos. A moment in history so carefully stage-managed, yet hiding cracks wide enough to shatter the monarchy's most tightly held illusions. The timing could not have been more precise or more dangerous. The interview dropped just days before a major royal anniversary, igniting speculation that this wasn't a coincidence, but a calculated detonation. And the impact was immediate. Within hours, royal aides scrambled behind the scenes, crisis meetings were called, spokespersons deflected, diffused, and in some cases disappeared. But the internet had already seized on it. Clips of the interview spread like wildfire, dissected frame by frame, and while the palace refused to comment directly, insiders admitted. He knows things only those inside the room would know. What set the world on edge wasn't just the revelation that something happened, it was the scale of what the butler claimed. He spoke of a meeting between Charles and senior aides. A conversation not documented, not archived, and not meant to be remembered. And yet, it was allegedly in that meeting where decisions were made, not just about a funeral but about a legacy. About Diana, about how her final hours in the public eye would be shaped, controlled, and in some cases, erased. And then came the quote that chilled even the most seasoned reporters. "What I witnessed, the world was never meant to know. No elaboration, no detail, just that." A statement that felt more like a warning than a confession. And from that moment, the story shifted from speculation to scandal. Not because of what was said, but because of what might still be hidden. To understand the truth behind the butler's confession, we must go back to the night where grief, guilt, and power collided behind palace walls. The world was preparing to mourn a princess. But inside Clarence's house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Grief wasn't the only thing haunting those halls. Secrets, tension, and an urgent meeting that has never been officially recorded, all swirled together in the hours before Diana's funeral. Charles had just returned from Paris. He had seen her body. He had walked through the hospital's sterile corridors. But when he stepped back into Clarence's house, the weight of what had happened didn't collapse onto him, it hardened around him. Those closest to him described him as hollowed out, not from sorrow alone, but from something more corrosive. Regret. Silence clung to him like smoke. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't eat. He didn't weep. And yet, despite his state, a meeting was called late in the evening. No documentation. No official minutes. No explanation. Only a few were summoned. Senior staff, select aides, and one butler who lingered longer than he was meant to. That butler would later say the moment felt off from the start. The private secretaries, who were usually composed, clinical, almost robotic in their loyalty, now seemed nervous, rattled, as if they knew the weight of the moment wasn't just about grief, it was about control. About what came next, about perception. Diana, the most photographed woman in the world, had become even more powerful in death. And the monarchy? It was on the back foot. The public outrage was palpable. Flowers piled at the gates, news anchors trembled on air, and inside those walls, fear was setting in. The butler described whispers he wasn't meant to hear. Discussions not about honoring Diana's memory, but about shaping it, about choosing the words, the images, the tone. Should it be solemn? Should it be stately? Should it be royal? Or should it be personal? There was no consensus, only anxiety. Then came the memo, brief, clinical, distributed to only a few hands. A list of proposals for funeral arrangements, points of messaging, restrictions for the press. The butler saw it on a table. A day later, it was gone. No copies. But it was one sentence not written in the memo, but spoken aloud that chilled him to his core. He wasn't sure who said it. Perhaps a private advisor, perhaps a family member. But the words cut through the room like glass. She cannot be bigger in death than she was in life. This was a crisis of legacy, a battle not just for the crown's survival, but for dominance over memory itself. The firm wasn't planning a funeral. It was engineering a narrative. But what began as logistical planning turned into something darker, as Charles received a visitor who would forever change that night's course. There's no official record, no entry in the guest logs. But Charles's former butler claims a prominent royal figure arrived that night unannounced, unwelcomed by some, but impossible to refuse. Their conversation, desperate, volatile, and sealed in silence. Until now. According to the butler, the knock at the side entrance came just after 10:30 p.m. No scheduled appointment, no briefing. Just a quiet word to staff. Clear the corridor, make no mention of who's inside. The visitor, shielded by shadows and escorted by a single bodyguard, was whisked into a private drawing room where Charles had been pacing alone for over an hour. Even in Clarence's house, this was abnormal. The butler had worked there long enough to recognize the signs this wasn't protocol. This was something else, something personal. What happened next was never meant to be witnessed. But for a few moments, the veil slipped. The butler was called in to serve drinks, 2 glasses, neat. The room was thick with tension. He was in and out in less than 30 seconds. But even then, he could feel the gravity in the air. And he heard it. Not a scream, not a sob, but something sharper. Urgent words, forcefully whispered, just loud enough to leave a mark. What followed behind that closed door, the butler only knows through fragments. But what he did hear, and what has haunted him since, was one line, delivered with steel. If you let this become her monarchy, it will never be yours. A warning, a threat, a desperate plea, depending on who you ask. The tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just grief, it was power slipping, panic rising. Diana wasn't just the mother of heirs. She had become something far more dangerous in death, untouchable. And for certain senior royals, that was unacceptable. Roughly 40 minutes later, the visitor stormed out, their face pale, their jaw clenched, the bodyguard trailing behind like a shadow. Staff were instructed to forget what they saw. No one asked questions, no one was supposed to, but whispers still found their way into the corners of Clarence's house that the visitor had threatened to override Charles. That they demanded Diana's funeral remain tightly within royal tradition. That they feared the people mourning outside would turn on the crown itself if allowed to see her as more than just a tragic figure. To this day, the palace has never confirmed who that person was. But insiders have quietly pointed to one figure, someone whose presence in that room would make sense, whose authority could not be ignored, and whose history with Diana was fraught with tension. The name remains unsaid. But the silence around it speaks volumes. But even that confrontation pales in comparison to what Charles allegedly did in the hours that followed, alone. According to the butler, what happened just after midnight wasn't a routine walk or restless pacing. It was something much darker. Charles was seen in a part of Clarence's house he hadn't entered in years. What he left behind would later be destroyed, but not before someone saw it. It was well past midnight when the corridors of Clarence's house fell into their rarest state, utter stillness. The staff had retreated, the voices had ceased, and the building exhaled the weight of a nation's grief. But Charles did not sleep. The butler, still awake, passing through the halls for reasons never disclosed, heard the sound of a heavy door opening, a door that hadn't moved in years, the door to the old study. A room sealed off not officially, but emotionally untouched since the early days of Charles and Diana's union. It was once her space, and it had remained dormant, preserved like a ghost left intentionally undisturbed. Charles entered alone. No security, no aides, no one followed. The butler kept his distance, cautious but compelled. From behind the cracked door, the smell of smoke crept out slowly. Faint at first, then heavier. Something was burning. Not furniture, not wood, paper, memories, regret. And then, a flicker, an unmistakable sound. The opening and closing of a small metal box. One that, according to a member of staff now long gone, had once contained letters exchanged between Charles and Diana, many never seen by anyone else. Some were affectionate, others accusatory. But they were hers, and they were his. The butler remained hidden in the shadows, long enough to see the faint orange glow dim, then vanish entirely. When the door finally creaked open, Charles emerged, his face pale, his eyes red. Not with rage, but with something deeper. Despair. A man no longer a husband, no longer just a royal, just a man haunted by a past he couldn't rewrite, and a future he no longer controlled. And as he walked away, he left behind a tray of smouldering ash in the fireplace. But not everything had turned to dust. In the hours that followed, the butler slipped into the study. Inside, silence lingered like smoke. Among the blackened fragments, he found something that hadn't burned through. A half-charred page, edges crumbling, ink blurred but legible in one place. A line that read, "They'll never let me be your truth." The butler folded the page, tucked it into his coat, and never mentioned it to anyone until now. By morning, the air had changed. The staff had been summoned, not for briefing, but for warning. A direct order came from one of Charles's top aides. Whatever you saw last night, you didn't. No further questions, no explanations. And just like that, the truth of that midnight descent was buried sealed behind loyalty oaths and fear. But not forgotten. But even amidst private guilt, there were public decisions to be made, and the firm was determined to control the narrative. While the public mourned, palace insiders waged a quiet war over Diana's memory, and the butler says Charles wasn't always on the winning side. What did the firm fear the most, and who gave the order that changed the funeral's entire tone? In the days leading up to Diana's funeral, the world was united in sorrow, but inside the royal machine, unity was the last thing holding. What unfolded behind closed doors was not reverence but resistance. According to the butler, once the mourning veil fell, the palace shifted into something far colder: strategy. Diana had become more than a woman, more than a princess. She was now a symbol, and that terrified the firm. From the funeral route to the hymns, every detail became a battlefield. There were suggestions to avoid them all, to route the procession through less public areas. It was argued that a grand public display could only fan the flames of Diana's growing mythos, but the people demanded visibility. The palace wanted restraint. One of the most telling points of contention was Elton John. His rewritten version of Candle in the Wind was not initially welcomed by senior aides. The butler recalls hearing a conversation where one advisor said flatly, "She's not a pop culture martyr." They feared the moment would tip the scales, transforming the funeral into a spectacle that cemented Diana as something even the monarchy couldn't control. But Charles, surprisingly, pushed back. The butler says he overheard him argue late one night, "This is not about us. Let the people say goodbye in their way." His voice cracked. He sounded, for once, not like a prince, but like a man trying to do right by someone he had failed. There was also a speech. Charles, the butler claims, had written a personal tribute, one laced with guilt and quiet admiration, meant to be delivered at the service, but it never saw the light of day. The document was reviewed, redacted, then rejected. The reason? Too emotional. Palace aides were adamant that the day remained strictly ceremonial, no raw edges. No remorse, just polished grief. One source allegedly quipped, "Let the people cry, not the crown." Then came perhaps the coldest remark of all. A comment the butler never forgot, spoken by a senior royal figure during a private meeting. Diana was a complication in life, and now she's a complication in death. That line, bitter and brutal, summed up the mood inside. The monarchy wasn't mourning, they were managing. They weren't honouring her, they were containing her. And Charles? According to the butler, he walked away from those final planning meetings pale and silent, described by staff as defeated. His efforts to inject sincerity had been stripped down, reshaped, and reduced until the day bore the weight of the institution, not the woman. And while the monarchy fought for control, one small act of rebellion slipped through and made it into the broadcast seen by the world. If you blinked, you missed it. A quiet moment during the funeral procession that wasn't in the plan. According to the butler, it wasn't authorized, wasn't expected, and almost didn't air. But it was Charles's last personal tribute to Diana, and the palace was furious. As the world watched the solemn procession snake its way through the heart of London, there was one moment, barely a few seconds, that escaped the precision of the palace's choreography. A moment not approved in advance, not rehearsed, and certainly not expected by the senior aides who had spent days scripting every gesture, every glance, every footstep. According to the butler, Charles had given a quiet instruction to one of the royal guards just hours before the ceremony began. It was simple, almost casual. When we pass that spot, pause, just briefly. No further explanation, no discussion. The command was relayed, noted, and met with silent confusion. But the order came from a prince, and it was obeyed. As the cortege approached the gates of St. James's, where Charles and Diana once stood smiling at the birth of a new chapter that would eventually dissolve into heartbreak, the moment came. The carriage slowed. The guard halted. And Charles, standing beside his sons, bowed not with the standard ceremonial tilt, but lower, slower. The butler, watching from behind the curtain of the official convoy, knew instantly this was no accident. It was deliberate, personal, defiant. What the cameras captured next became the subject of fierce speculation. A subtle adjustment of Charles' lapel, just before the bow. Observers watching the raw feed later claimed they saw something glint, a pin, or perhaps a brooch. Insiders whispered it was Diana's favourite stone, one she used to wear on casual outings, gifted to her during their early years. A quiet nod, buried in symbolism, worn beneath the armour of protocol. But that moment, fleeting as it was, didn't make it to every screen. A delay in the BBC's broadcast, allegedly due to a technical adjustment, trimmed the shot by mere seconds, enough to cut the pause, enough to soften the bow. When questioned, the BBC issued a vague denial, stating there was no intentional removal of any sequence. But the butler, certain of what he saw and when, insisted otherwise. They knew, and they cut it. It wasn't their tribute to make it was his, and they erased it. What makes this moment matter isn't the gesture itself, but the rebellion behind it. Charles, constrained, cornered, and publicly composed, chose that single, unspoken act to say what he could never include in speeches or statements. Not as a king in waiting, not as a Windsor, but as a man who once loved, lost, and failed someone he could never forget. It was his goodbye, not the firm's, the butler said, with a conviction no protocol could wash away. But behind every act of grief, there was still fear. And the night ended not with peace, but with a warning. Just before dawn, hours before the world watched history unfold, Charles received a message, handwritten, unsigned, and slid under his door. According to the butler, it was a threat, and it changed how Charles approached Diana's final farewell forever. The sun hadn't yet risen over Clarence house. The corridors were silent, cloaked in that eerie stillness that arrives before history is made. But one man was already awake, the butler. He had risen early, as he always did. But what he saw that morning was different. Outside Charles's bedroom door, an envelope, cream-coloured, unmarked, no royal crest, no insignia, just a single line of ink, His Royal Highness. That was all, and it hadn't been there an hour before. The butler hesitated. Something about it felt off. But procedure was procedure. He left it untouched. When Charles emerged later, he said nothing at first, simply nodded, picked up the envelope, and retreated inside. What happened next, according to the butler, would leave him shaken for years. He was called into the study minutes later. The fire had already been lit. Charles stood before it, clutching the letter. His face, usually unreadable, was ashen. His hands trembled. Without a word, he tossed the paper into the flames. It curled instantly, blackening at the edges. The only phrase the butler would ever recall hearing was whispered under Charles's breath. "They don't want a reckoning." Then silence. Thick. Final. The planned statement Charles was due to deliver that morning, a brief televised address paying tribute to Diana, was abruptly cancelled. No reason was given. The press office scrambled, citing logistics. But those inside Clarence house knew better. Something had shifted. Security, which had already been heightened in the wake of Diana's death, was increased even further. Guards were repositioned, perimeters rechecked. The butler noted that new faces appeared among the detail, quiet men, unspeaking, unintroduced. When questioned, the usual answers were avoided. There had been no credible threat, they insisted. Just a precaution. But within the walls of the palace, paranoia bloomed. Someone who knew exactly where Charles would be that night, and who had something to lose if he spoke freely. The butler never saw the contents, and he never asked again. But the effect it had was undeniable. Charles's demeanour changed in the hours that followed. The fire that had flickered in his defences after the argument with aides, after the quiet tribute at the procession, was gone. What replaced it was something colder, resigned, controlled. When he appeared before the cameras, he was stone, his eyes vacant. The vulnerability of the night before had been scrubbed clean. The tone shifted that morning. The butler later recalled. Something had changed, and not for the better. Whatever power that letter held, it worked. Charles fell back in line. The firm's hold was reasserted, and the version of history that would be remembered, the one carefully curated, edited, approved, went ahead without interruption. But one man had seen behind the curtain, had watched the fire and read the silence. And while the monarchy buried its secrets, the butler carried his truth for over 25 years. For decades, the former butler stayed silent. He watched, he waited, and he endured. But something finally pushed him to speak. Was it guilt, fear, or justice? What he reveals now may forever alter how we remember the night before Diana's funeral. He had been there for everything: the whispered arguments, the trembling hands, the unsent speeches, and the ashes left behind. But the one thing he had never broken was the promise. A vow made not to the institution, not to the crown, but to a woman who had once looked him in the eyes and said, "Don't let them change the ending." The butler had nodded, holding her trust like a relic, even after her life had been stolen by tragedy and her legacy twisted in layers of pageantry. For years, he told himself silence was loyalty. That, protecting the truth, was different from exposing it. But eventually, the silence began to rot. And the truth, like all secrets, grew heavier with time. He wrote everything down, not for revenge, but for memory. Private notes, locked away in an old desk drawer, never shared, never sold. But when a recent health scare sent him to the hospital and doctors mentioned the word urgent, everything shifted. Mortality has a way of burning through hesitation. He knew he didn't have the luxury of waiting any longer. The world deserved to know what really happened the night before the nation wept. The butler contacted a single journalist, one he'd followed from a distance, someone he trusted not to sensationalize, but to listen. The journal was delivered by hand, No email, no press conference, just a simple message. It's time. In the pages, he explains how he lived in quiet fear, not of exposure, but of retaliation. There were things he saw that the public was never meant to. There were whispers of phone calls that never appeared on records, of orders delivered face to face, so nothing could be traced. He recounts standing in doorways, out of view, and hearing the kind of grief that breaks even the most hardened men. But he also recalls being warned twice by unnamed staff to forget what you think you heard. He feared the reach of royal security, feared that silence was his only shield. Until now. And so, the butler's final words aren't accusatory. They're not drenched in bitterness. They're stripped of drama, raw in their simplicity. I did not come forward to destroy. I came forward because I've spent half my life pretending that night didn't matter. It did. It changed everything. And pretending it didn't is the real betrayal. He closes the journal with a single sentence. History will judge, but I lived it. And with his story now out, the world must ask, what does this mean for the future of the monarchy? Now that the truth has emerged, can the monarchy survive it? What began as whispers behind palace doors is now a global reckoning. As the world re-examines a royal funeral watched by billions, one question remains: how much was real and how much was staged? The release of the butler's journal has ignited something the palace never anticipated. Memory turned into movement. Across social media, old footage is being replayed, reanalyzed, reinterpreted. Clips that once seemed solemn now strike a different chord, nuanced with a tone of performance, restraint, even manipulation. A princess beloved by the public was given a farewell fit for royalty. Yes, but was it the farewell she would have wanted? That's what people are asking. And the answers aren't coming from the crown, they're coming from the silence surrounding it. A petition, once fringe, has gained rapid traction, demanding the full declassification of the royal funeral planning documents. Signatures flood in from around the world. Former civil servants have stepped forward anonymously, backing the request, stating that the public has a right to know whether the most watched funeral of the 20th century was carefully orchestrated to preserve an image or conceal the truth. The demand is simple: transparency. But for the monarchy, it's anything but. King Charles, now weathered by age and scandal, remains publicly stoic, yet insiders say he's never looked more strained. Events that once unified the royal family now highlight its fractures. At public appearances, William maintains composure, but his words grow colder. Harry, as expected, remains oceans away, offering no comment, but the timing of his silence says more than any press release could. And beneath it all, the younger generation of royals, George, Charlotte, Louis, are being raised in a world that now questions everything once accepted as sacred. Historians, too, are divided. Some argue the palace made impossible choices under impossible pressure, that what the butler witnessed was not conspiracy, but confusion, chaos within grief. Others aren't so forgiving. They see it as a carefully calculated power play, a moment where the firm feared that Diana, even in death, could overshadow the crown's control. Was this a cover-up or a collapse? One academic asked on national television. Or was it both? Because Diana, for all her humanity, never belonged to the institution. She belonged to the people. And the people are speaking. With louder voices than the palace ever expected. With sharper questions than the monarchy wants to answer. As headlines turn to inquiries and documentaries reach millions, the legacy of one woman, her life, her pain, her departure continues to haunt those who tried to contain her. The crown may have buried a princess, but not her truth. That truth lingers like a ghost in Westminster, in the eyes of her sons, in the voice of the man who finally broke his silence. Because in the end, perhaps Diana's last act wasn't her life or her death, but the questions she left behind, the questions the crown can no longer avoid. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.